All right, you guys, welcome back, and we are going to be taking a look at a game from round 9 played today in the Tata Steel Chess Masters between Magnus Carlsen, the reigning world champion, and Shakhriyar Mamedyarov. Now, this is a very important matchup. Both players are tied for the lead. They both have 5.5 points out of 8, and this game will go a long way in terms of determining who's going to win the event. All right, so Magnus starts with d4 here. Shakhriyar plays knight f6. We have knight f3, and now d5. Again, not really sure about the move order for Magnus in terms of playing knight f3 here versus, say, playing g3 or c4 in lieu of what we see in the game, but still worth noting. We have knight f3, d5, c4, pawn to e6, and now Magnus plays g3. Again, continuing the theme of this tournament of playing the Catalan defense. He did play it in the World Chess Championship match against Jan Nepomniachtchi, and he's had quite a bit of success here in Tata Steel. He won against Anish Giri. He also won against Richard Rapport with it. So it's an opening that he's very familiar with. So we have e6, g3 played here. D takes c4. Bishop to g2, and now here Shakhriyar plays bishop b4. Now, one thing that I alluded to in our previous coverage of the game, which Magnus won against Richard, is that chess players are very unique. Everybody plays different setups against certain openings. And so while I'd be interested to know what Magnus was going to play against a standard classical setup with bishop e7, bishop g2, castles, I think that Magnus knew that Shakhriyar does not really play that setup, and therefore it was a safe choice to go into the Catalan once again. So we have D takes c4, bishop g2, and now Shakhriyar plays bishop b4 check, bishop d2, and pawn to a5. Now, the idea behind playing pawn to a5 here is twofold. First of all, you could protect the bishop on b4, pretty obviously, but additionally, you also might want to start pushing these pawns on the queen side, try to get a setup with the pawns on a5, c6, b5, and c4 here, and argue that this extra pawn on c4 is really important. Additionally, if white plays a move like queen c1, which is very reasonable, or say a move like a4 actually is more thematic in a sense. After black castles here and white castles, you can play something like knight c6. Say white goes bishop takes b4, knight takes b4, and even if white is able to get back the pawn with, say, queen c1, c6, queen c4, for example, you have this great outpost for the knight on b4, and it only happens because you have the pawn on a5 to protect it. So by playing a5, this is sort of a multifunctional move, and it does a lot of different things all at the same time. So now we have castles played here by Magnus, and now castle played by Shakhriyar, and here Magnus plays pawn to e3. Now, the idea behind e3 is that even though you're down this pawn on c4, you feel that long term you're going to be able to play in the center here, and you want to prevent ideas like, say, knight c6, which put tempo on the pawn on d4. For example, say you play a move like knight c3, knight c6, you'll notice d4 is very weak. So e3 is a very prophylactic move. Protect the pawn in the center. Additionally, you can go queen c2 or queen e2, and you wait to see what setup black intends to play here. So we have e3, rook to a6 played here by Shakhriyar. Now, this is a very interesting idea, but perhaps in retrospect, not the best way to play. Objectively here, I think it would have made a little bit more sense to try and strike in the center right away with something like knight bd7 followed by pawn to c5, or even say knight bd7, queen to c1, queen e7, queen takes c4, and then c6 followed by e5 as well. I feel like this is a little bit more thematic, a little bit more traditional, whereas in the game, as we're going to see, it looks really good for black. Black is going to be able to maintain the extra pawn, but you're going to have some issues with this rook placement. So after rook to a6 is played, also worth noting, another reason you play rook a6 is to sidestep threats on diagonal. So you play just a move like b5, for example, after a4, c6 here. Now white can play something like knight to e5 potentially and open up this long diagonal. Additionally, as well, if you do get this specific position with c6 after a b5, you're in a lot of trouble here because bishop d2, I go knight f takes d2, and now you're unable to capture the pawn on b5 because I capture your rook, and probably the best you have here is something like knight d5, but after b takes c6, knight takes c6, knight c4, bishop a6, knight b to d2, white is simply up a pawn here and doing very, very well. So in this position, you kind of want to avoid any tricks on the diagonal, so rook a6 has quite a bit of merit. So we get queen c2 played here, pawn to b5, we have a4 played, and now you have c6 played by Shakhriyar. Pretty obvious idea. Black wants to keep this extra pawn on c4, keep it guarded, and try to argue that you're simply up a pawn, and long-term black will be able to finish this development like knight d7, bishop b7, and the pawn should play in an endgame. So after c6 is played, we have knight to c3 played here by Magnus. Now Shakhriyar plays rook b6. Again, you do not really want to break up the pawn chain. If you take on a4 after knight takes a4, now c4 is super weak. Additionally, my knight can hop to c5 later on as well. So b takes a4 is not the move that you want to play, and at the same time white's threatening to win the pawn. So another move you could try is something like bishop d7, but again, even though you protect the pawn, after white plays e4 followed by e5, you really have problems with this knight on b8. You can't really develop it. Both d7, the d7 square and the a6 square are covered, so you run into some development issues here. So instead, we have rook b6 being played here by Shakhriyar, and now Magnus plays pawn to e4. Again, there's not much you can do on the queen side. If you take the pawn, you undouble the pawns, and now also you open up this nice long diagonal for black's light squared bishop. So you don't really want to do that. Additionally, what else can you really do? If you play b3, again, not a great move, because for example, I can also just trade on c3, play something like b4, bishop d2, c3, and now I have this great connected pawn chain here, and white is completely lost. So if you can't really do anything on the queen side, then you have to look, well, can I do anything on the king side? Now maybe you can play h3 g4, but it's a little bit slow, and it also weakens your king position as well on g1. So now e4 is played, which is the other logical idea. Try to play in the center. Now you'll also note that this can happen out of a lot of different variations of the Slav defense, which is why it's important to know all these different openings. So I'm just going to go back to the start very briefly to give you one example of where you can have something like that. So one of the most common variations that can be played is something like this. Now this is out of the Slav, very different obviously in many ways, but again you'll see that you get a similar position where the pawns on d4 and e4 relative to the pawns on c6, b5, and c4. So this is worth noting. So to go back to the position here after e4, even though pieces are placed a little bit differently, it's very similar to many games in the Slav defense. Now e4 is played, and here Shakhriyar plays bishop e7. Now amazingly, this is the move that costs Shakh the game, and you kind of wonder, well, how can one move cost you the game? Now this position is very dynamic. There's a lot going on, and so you have to come up with an idea. Now the first problem here is, let's just say you play an obvious move like bishop to b7 to develop the bishop and follow up with knight d7. After white goes to e5 here, you play knight d5, and now white has a very nasty idea, knight to g5, threatening checkmate on h7. You play h6, I go queen h7 mate. Don't allow checkmate to 1 on h7 like Vladimir Kramnik. So what you do is you play g6 here, but after g6, now it's a little bit of Swiss cheese here on these dark squares, and after knight ge4 followed by bishop to h6, or maybe knight d5 and knight f6, there are some problems for black. Computer says it's still relatively okay, but it can feel a little bit uncomfortable here for us humans. So instead of bishop b7, Shakh decides, well, an obvious way I can play this is bishop e7, because now after e5, knight d5, you no longer have knight g5, because then black just grabs it. After bishop takes, queen g5, black is simply up a piece here. And at the same time, when Shakh plays this, he also calculated a very long line here, which is he calculated after knight d5, knight takes d5, c takes d5, bishop takes a5 here, which wins the rook on b6. He can go b4, bishop b6, queen b6. Now the computer says that white is maybe still a little bit better here, but black has this very threatening queenside pawn majority here. There's also knight c6, which puts a lot of pressure on d4 and e5 as well, and the rooks are a little bit clumsy here. The a file is closed, and you can't really make use of the rook. So even though rooks objectively are worth more than knights and bishops, in this case with no open files, black has ample compensation for the exchange sacrifice that he has made here. So Shakh saw this, and then additionally I suspect that Shakh saw what happens in the game. So he saw pawn takes pawn, and here in this position there is one alternative rather than going right down the rabbit hole like Neo, which is that you can play knight to b4. Now after knight b4, queen to e4, c takes b5, I suspect that Shakh thought rook takes a5, and material is even here, but additionally after say a move like bishop b7, queen g4, it feels like your king is under attack here. There are ideas like bishop h6, say you play knight d7, bishop h6, not take the bishop because of the pin, and you have to go g6, and then I just take your rook. So you can't really play knight d7. Additionally, if you play a move like king h8, for example, you kind of get a little bit scared about something like queen h5, maybe like a knight g5 or bishop g5, and it feels a touch loose. Now as I said before, computer says that this is all relatively okay for black, but over the board, without knowing what the absolute best moves are, it's very easy to start seeing some ghosts and getting afraid about the kingside play. So in this position, Shakhriyar basically tries to follow up with the idea that we looked at before, which is he takes on b5, and now after knight takes d5, pawn takes knight, bishop a5, he plays knight c6, and now bishop b6, queen b6 occurs. So those of you who are watching the video, you should probably pause here for a second as we have this position, and then we will go back to this position. So pause the video for a second and try to figure out what the big difference is. All right, So those of you who did pause the video and look at it and try to see what the difference is, that there's one big difference, which is that in this position the A file is completely open. Now again, rooks are really important when they have open files. Rooks are most powerful when there are open files where they can move side to side. So even though this is very similar to the previous position that we looked at, in this position after rook A8, white's rooks are now very active, and white can actually stack the rooks on the only open file of the board and create a lot of havoc, especially from A8 towards where the black king is here on G8. So as I said before, very basic theme, but very hard to see in the moment. And Shakhriyar, I'm not sure if he missed this idea of rook A and rook A1, or he simply thought, you know, it looks like an interesting exchange stack. I'm getting my pawns rolling. Maybe the center is weak. Hard to judge what exactly he missed. But for Magnus does not miss very often. And especially when it comes down to very basic, simple themes, he pretty much never misses. So we have rook to A8 played here by Magnus. Shakh plays to H6. And as I said before, the big difference here is that if we go back to the other position with the file closed here, let's say white plays a move like B3, just to use an example, something that actually looks really good in the other variation. After C3 followed by knight to C6, you'll notice that it's a little bit tough to play. Like, sure, you can go A5, rook D1, knight C6, and maybe bishop F1 and claim an edge, but there aren't obvious threats, and black can obviously develop his pieces here. When we go back to the actual game with this position after rook A8, you'll notice that when black develops the bishop, first of all, I can obviously trade, but also I can play rook A1, and I can start to harass the pieces on the queen side here. I have something like rook A6. I also have time to maybe even reroute the bishop later on or move the knight away, and black doesn't really have a whole lot going on. Now B4 is the obvious move, but the reason I won't explain B4 here is because it's actually very similar to the game, and we don't want to give away anything. So after rook to A8 is played here, Shakh plays to H6, and now we have rook F1, and now we have bishop to E6. Now it's worth noting, as someone in chat just asked me, if black plays knight takes D4 here, white can trade on D4 and follow it up with rook to D1. And after queen takes E5, I think both moves are good, but rook takes D5 is technically the best move, except for queen E1, bishop F1. You'll notice that both the rooks are very active here. Additionally, this bishop on E7 is passive, and this chain is super soft on B5 and C4. So the only realistic try here is to play something like bishop H3, but after rook F8, bishop takes F8, white can go queen to E2 here, guard the bishop, and after say queen C1, I can now play this move rook to D1 and win the game. So after rook F1, bishop to E6 is played by Shakh. Again, he wants long-term to take the pawn, but before he takes this pawn, he wants to guard D5 with the bishop. And additionally, he really wants to try to move these queenside pawns, the B pawns and the C pawns, specifically further down the board so he can try to create some threats. So bishop E6 is played here. Now Magnus makes the absolute best move in the position, and a move that the reason I say it's the best move is not because it protects the pawn with queen D1, but understanding the difference between queen D2 and queen D1. So queen D2 is also a very logical move that protects the pawn on D4, but after a move like B4 here, you cannot put even more pressure on the A file. So that's the reason that queen D1 is the best move, because now after let's just say black doesn't play B4, because this is in fact a mistake. Let's say black plays a move like G6 here. White can now go rook to A6, queen to B7, and triple stack with queen to A1. And you'll notice that again, white is making absolute perfect use of the rooks and the queen here on A1, A6, and A8 in this position. So again, open files are super important in the game of chess, especially when you have material advantages and you have, say, an extra rook on the board. This is really dank. And yeah, someone might say an engine Andy. I'm not using the engine right now, obviously. But beyond that, it's just one of those themes that's really tough to spot. But Magnus understands it here, and so he understands the idea of triple stacking on the A file, understanding the idea that the rooks are most effective on the open file. So now Shakh plays the move that, again, hard to be critical of this move because it's probably the best move. But after this next move, which is B4, which looks very human, Magnus, again, just absolutely ruthless here, plays this move pawn to B3. And the reason this is so annoying and effectively in some ways ends the game is that here, if you don't do anything with the pawn, say you just play just a random move to highlight the problem, you go something like H5, I'll trade the rooks, I'll take on C4, and after D takes C4, I have D5 forking the bishop and the knight. So after B3, you really have to decide what you're doing here. Now you could take on B3, but again, if you take on B3 after a move like rook A6, queen B7, queen takes B3, now you just have a lone pass pawn, which is blockaded. And again, these rooks are on the open file. and white can even reroute the bishop later on to create threats towards h7 from d3. So you don't really want to take on b3. So the obvious move here that you want to play is pawn to c3, and you want to get this protected passed pawn. So after we have c3, Magnus plays rook a6, queen to c7, and now he plays knight e1, and this is just perfect play by Magnus, because now what you'll notice is the rooks still control the a file, obviously, but by closing this queenside, closing the queenside on the b and c files here, even though black is the passed pawn on c3, white has a very simple plan. You go knight to c2 and blockade. So let me just make a random move like rook d8. Now after knight c2, I blockade. Your c pawn can no longer move. Additionally, I can now play for things like knight to e3 followed by f4 and f5. Just to highlight it, say g6, bishop f1, king g7, bishop d3, followed by f4. I'll just make a random move like bishop f8, f4, and again I'm going to go queen f3, I'm going to go f5, and black has no threats. All your queenside play is dried up. You have no way to attack the pawn, so you can't attack this pawn. Knight guards, and it stops your passed pawn. Everything has been prevented here with this lone knight being on c2. So in this position, Shakhriyar takes a long time. He really sees that after knight c2 there's going to be no counterplay, and he basically plays the move that loses on the spot, which is pawn to f6. Again, I cannot blame him because he saw the problems that were looming 5-10 moves down the road with the knight on c2, and that's just how it goes. So he plays f6, trying to create some counterplay. Magnus, again, just absolutely on point today, plays this move knight to d3. Does not go to c2 because now he realizes that from d3, having played f6, the bishop is weak on e6. I have knight f4. I can target the bishop on e6. I can target the pawn on d5. Additionally, these two rooks, again, they're providing so many they're creating such havoc for the black coordination of the pieces on the 6th rank here, and so you're basically lost after this move. So we get knight d3, and now f takes e5, played by Shakh. Really, at this point, he could have resigned. I think the computer says the best move here, as I recall, was something like g5 to stop knight f4, but you're never going to see that in a human game. And the only other opportunity is knight takes d4. But after rook takes e6, if you take the rook, I have bishop d5, queen to b6 guards the knight because of the pin, but now I have knight f4, overloading the knight, and you'll lose the game because you're going to lose the knight on e6 here. And after rook e6, if you try a move like c2, I can now go queen to g4, protect the rook on e6. You cannot queen the pawn because I just take, and my knight guards the rook. And if you take the rook after queen takes, I simply have a knight and bishop versus bishop. And after, say, king to h8, there are many ways that are winning, but I'm going to assume that rook c1 is the cleanest way to win here. So in this position, knight takes d4 doesn't work, so Shakh just takes on e5. Again, Magnus plays the perfect move, knight takes e5. Cannot take the pawn because the queen guards. Additionally, if you play knight d8, again, I think rook takes e6 is also winning. Maybe even rook a7, queen d6, rook 1 to a6. And again, you're overloaded here. Everything's under attack from the side. So you can't do that. And Shakh basically plays knight takes e5, the only other move. And after rook takes e6 here, if you move the knight to c6, I have bishop d5, and you lose the game because of this. And if you move the knight to, let's say, f7, again, just bishop d5, followed by like queen e2 and rook e1. And the c pawn is going nowhere, so the two rooks are way too powerful. So after rook e6, Shakh plays c2, and Magnus plays queen to e1 here. Again, another perfect move, because now if you move the knight away to, say, f7, I take on e7, and the queen guards the rook, and it guards the c1 square very importantly. And you cannot move the knight to g6, so I just take the knight. If you go knight c6 here, again, I take on d5, and the attack of the knight on c6 combined with all the different discovered attacks and fossils here leads to a victory for white as well. So you can't really move the knight to any of those squares. And if you play knight to d3, attacking the queen, again, I can just go rook takes e7. If you take my queen, I take your queen, I have an extra tower. And if you make the queen here on c1, I can just trade on c1, take the pawn on d5, and after king to h8, bishop c4. This is completely winning. Black is down 2 pawns here. White is 5 pawns, black is 3. Knight is very bad, and I'm also just going to be pushing this d pawn up the board very shortly, so you would resign here. So knight d3 doesn't work, so that's why in this position, after queen to e1, in this position, Shakhriyar resigns here. Again, no moves, no knight moves. If you play bishop g5, one last attempt at playing c1. Many different ways for white to win, but probably the cleanest is to play d takes e5, c1 queen takes, queen takes, you trade, and again, after bishop b5, king h8, f4, I do the connect 4 in the center of the board, and the game automatically ends with a victory for the player with the white pieces. So therefore, there's really no hope here. And again, after this brilliant move, queen to e1, Shakhriyar resigns, and with that, Magnus takes a commanding lead in the tournament. Shakhriyar was the other player who was tied with him, so he now has a half-point lead over Anish Giri at this point. They have played each other, so it's pretty unlikely Magnus will get caught, but there still is going to be some drama. At any rate, masterful game by Magnus. Really nothing that I can say other than he played a perfect game. From moves, from about the time that he played e5, so around the time that he played this move pawn to e5, I would say from move 13 till the very end of the game, absolutely perfectly played. I don't think anybody could have done better, not even Stockfish or Leela. So props to Magnus for a perfect game. But once again, you guys, one of the things you want to understand when you look at top level games, it's not solely about the wow factor, seeing the best moves, but trying to understand the concepts and implement them in your own games when you have those opportunities. So the moral of the story and the one takeaway is that when there are exchange sacrifices or you have imbalances like a knight and bishop for a rook, for example, or a rook for a knight, try to get open files, try to put those rooks on those open files. That is where rooks belong in the game of chess.